monuments to host dictators or prime ministers today from XU is Mr. Lee.
Let's make it clear. We're going to put this debate in a context of general post-war scenarios, Madam Chair. The question basically is, what is the best thing for you to do with respect to the monuments that are dedicated to dictators after they have been deposed, as the motion calls for. Obviously, Madam Chair, we're not going to talk about a general checklist of all the existing monuments all over the world and explain to you why we have to take down each and every one of them. We're going to generally characterize these monuments as those that have been dedicated primarily to celebrate the existence and the staying in power of these individuals who were there and committed genocides and ethnic cleansing and human rights violations, corruption, and everything else that runs against the concept of a democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about, for example, the statue of Saddam Hussein, or those documents that are self-serving and self-published documents of individuals that try to affirm the validity and the morality of their actions, such as those of people like Charles Taylor or Milosevic, or those people who try to sit down, both of you, who try to talk about legitimizing the actions of these people. First of all, as Prime Minister, I'm going to talk about what these monuments are, and I'm going to talk about, and nuance specifically to transitioning democracy, answering the question, what is really the role of a transitioning democracy, and which paradigm better sets the interests of the people and the government and the nation that is transitioning to democracy as a whole. Sit down, both of you. Now, first of all, let's talk about the monuments, ladies and gentlemen. These are basically anything that celebrates the subject's existence, actions, and legacies. These are monuments that dictators put up that have used the blood, sweat, and the tears of people, and using illegally accumulated resources, Madam Chair. When a dictator puts this up, he puts this up as a sign that from here on after, the story of that nation will be his and his alone, and he gets to tell how these things happen. And this is where he gets the power of all his supporters, Madam Chair, and this is how he empowers all his supporters, Madam Chair, and this is how he necessarily symbolizes everything that he has done and his personal ideologies. Before continuing, yes?
It's not about whether or not the dictator put it for a specific purpose. It's about the fact that you acknowledge a certain dictator did have a role within the particular state at that particular time. It's about the present time.
And the fact alone, Madam Chair, that you recognize that this person, that you recognize and acknowledge and even go as far as to legitimize the role of the person, sit down, both of you, of the time when he was still in regime, is something that we don't want to exist in a transitioning democracy, Madam Chair. And I'm going to talk about that later, because we understand that there was a reason why these people acted there in the first place, and explain why, in the context of a transitioning democracy, that's not the best thing for you to do. So basically, I'm going to talk about the principle. What is the role of a transitioning democracy, and why do we have to take these things down? Remember, Madam Chair, we're talking about the context of wherein the dictator has already been deposed, meaning the good guys already won, Madam Chair. It's basically a political sit-down, basically a political victory. It's the coup de grace to the defeat of a public enemy, Madam Chair, an individual who committed human rights violations. Transitioning democracies are expected to support the survivors of an oppressive regime, Madam Chair. The people who have wasted their lives and families in order to be able to create a better future, Madam Chair. Because remember, dictators are the antithesis of everything democratic. These are the people who destroy lives, who take away your liberty and your property, everything that a democracy is about, Madam Chair. And when you are a country that goes on to become a democracy and is set to become a democracy, sit down, you're expected to go against anything that symbolizes these things. It is the duty of the government to actively participate in affirming that these people have won. But how does this affect the people on the ground? Sit down. We're talking about the interest of the survivors of the oppressive regime. Governments owe to the families of these people not just infrastructural or material, but also mental and spiritual reparation and well-being. We're talking about those personal resentments that family members had of the soldiers or the people that have been tortured by these dictators, Madam Chair, of these people who have not been given fair trials, of these people who have not been treated properly because they tried to oppose these dictators, Madam Chair. And we think that this, although it may not feel tangible, these things are tangible in itself. For example, The fact alone that these individuals, that these transitioning democracies will need the support of the survivors of these oppressive regimes. We're talking about the building of a nation, as citizens who need to be unified as a whole. But more importantly, Madam Chair, we want to see how it even disempowers supporters of the dictator on the ground. Because if you look at the psyche of the supporters of this dictator, these are individuals who are usually extremely indoctrinated or otherwise brainwashed of the beliefs of these dictators. These are the people who will follow and imitate and even repeat the things that the dictator himself has done. But what do these monuments do, Manager? These are the symbols. Remember that when the supporters of a dictator see their leader being killed, they would normally run into hiding. But we see, if you look at the monuments that stand there, we think that it's going to have the same effect because it's going to send a message that you have lost. You have to stop all the illegal things that you're doing and the leaders that made you do in the past, and then you have to go with us in this transitioning democracy. These monuments stand as a message, and if we take them down, we take that symbol and we take that power down, ladies and gentlemen. What does this mean on the ground? All those political access and the acts of violence that these people might do in retaliation will also fall, definitely, Madam Chair, and it's going to be the fatal blow to these people. But then again, we understand that there might be a value, Madam Chair, to the opposition in every democracy. But this is something that should not be given precedence in a time when you need to reunify a nation, Madam Chair. Especially if, Madam Chair, this opposition has a history of human rights violations, which is very much something that's against any kind of democracy, whether it's transitioning or not, ladies and gentlemen. So therefore, in this debate, we're talking about the interests of the rebuilding of a nation that is going to become a democracy, surviving the tyranny of an individual who committed human rights violations. Therefore, we ask ourselves, what is the best interest of a transitioning democracy? We take these monuments down, Madam Chair. We take anything that's going to necessarily cause all the problems which I explained to you earlier. And for all these reasons, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Right, now next, the Prime Minister calls up LO for his name, Mr. Allen.
Now, if I've read the motion clearly, it says that this has to erase the legacies and tear down monuments. So, unfortunately, the case from the side government has focused only on tearing down monuments. They haven't really focused about erasing legacies in terms of history. How exactly they'll go about erasing their legacy as well. So that was one burden that lay on them. Besides the second burden of raising the statues and everything, and the monuments and all. So they haven't really talked about what exactly they mean by erasing legacies and how exactly are they going to go about erasing their legacy as a whole from the people in China. That is the first level on which they fail. On the second level, we believe that their assertion, their case essentially rests on two fundamental assumptions. The first assumption being that the dictator who was there only did bad things. He was a bloodhound, was an evil dictator who never did anything good. That is the first inherent assumption which we feel is fundamentally incorrect, because the first thing that all dictators require is legitimacy from the very people. That is why they have no option to try and do good things for the people, right? So we believe that these dictators have done good things. So your fundamental assumption that rests that they only did bad things is logically incorrect. The second assumption being that these dictators simply have no support whatsoever from the mass of the people. The population rating is 0%. That is the second fundamental incorrect assumption, because we believe on a number of occasions, even when dictators have been deposed, there are sections of the society and the population that still support those dictators. That is their very freedom of political choice of these very people, and that is that very freedom of political choice that you are denying to these very people by breaking down their monuments, by erasing history. That is what we fundamentally against. Do not take away the freedom of political choice of these very people, because it is their right to support educated if they want to. The other argument that they could come up with was about transitioning democracy, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I don't really see how a transitioning democracy would automatically become a good democracy or a strong democracy once you've erased all the statues, ladies and gentlemen. Because it is the role of the transitioning democracy to take care of its people, ladies and gentlemen, to give them the best amount of things, to give them food, shelter, and clothing, or whatever the people want, to make sure that the will of the people is heard in the best manner possible, to make sure that they are the true representatives of the mandate that they've gotten from the people, not to tear down statues or to abstract things such as removing legacies, ladies and gentlemen. That is not the role of transitioning democracy. The role of a transitioning democracy is to strengthen itself by doing good to people and gaining legitimacy through the voice of the people, by doing good to the people, not raising and removing statues and legacies like you would want to do, ladies and gentlemen. That is exactly what we're talking about. And also, there is a fundamental assertion that once you're removing these statues, what you're simply saying is that the good guys won, ladies and gentlemen. You don't really see how good guys won, because fundamentally when the government is removing such statues, the government is sending a very bad and violent image of itself, ladies and gentlemen. It is sending an image of its own, of itself, being very autocratic and being very dictatorial, ladies and gentlemen. And that we believe that is one image that no democracy or even transitional democracy should not give and cannot be denied. Which takes me directly to my own positive case. We're going to argue our case on three fundamental lines of argument. We're firstly going to talk about how historical revisionism within itself is incorrect, and within revisionism, we're going to talk about legacies and monuments both. Secondly, we're going to talk about the acknowledgement of the actions of all dictators. Thirdly, we're going to talk about how any democracy or even transitional democracy is supposed to work. Now, I being the first speaker shall lead with the first two lines of argument, my second speaker shall lead the third one, and I argue with the refugees. Now, moving on to our first line of argument about how revisionism is inherently something that is incorrect. Now, what exactly is revisionism? Revisionism is exactly when you're altering the course of history, right? When you're changing history according to your own will, how you believe history actually occurred, but no, you want to show it in a different light. And that is exactly what you're doing when you're changing, when you're altering their legacies and, like for example, removing their legacies and taking them on, right? You believe that is essentially fundamentally incorrect. Why? Because they're simply altering the course of evolution that the country actually went through, right? Your society, the course of evolution, the way it happened, ladies and gentlemen. So what are you essentially doing as a result of it? What you're simply doing is that you're presenting to your people something that essentially did not happen, ladies and gentlemen. So the fundamental thing and fundamental function that history serves, of that making your people learn about something, that making your people learn about what happened and probably learning from it so that they can in the future work in a better manner possible, that is essentially what you're moving. You believe that the people have the right to information, and the right to information rests within history as well. And you believe that by that very right, this history needs to be represented in the best manner possible, in the correct manner possible, exactly the way it happened, ladies and gentlemen. And you believe there is no right as a part of any government to show to present its own form of history to anyone, ladies and gentlemen, because inherently what you're doing is that you're trying to change history. And you believe history cannot be changed, because history remains with the people within itself. No matter how much the government tries to change history, no matter how much it changes textbooks, history cannot simply be erased. History rests with the people. The same way that folklore, like for example, let's take an example over it. Folklore through cultures have remained. How? Because they pass from people to people. Even folklore that don't really have any written document of their sort, they still remain over there. By that method as well, history will still remain there. Even if the government removes history through any legislative act, removes it from textbooks, it will simply remain with people. So history still remains with people. But if the government changes it, that is where the clash would come in. The people would simply see the government as being oppressive and tyrannical. I'll state you in a minute, and would simply say that no, history happened in a different manner, our government wants to say it in a different manner. And therefore the sentiments towards the government would simply move away, because like I said before, people do support dictators, and people do have the right to support dictators because it is their own political choice, and the government has no right to take it away. Yes, sir.
How can my family understand that we've already won and taken down a human rights abuser when on the street the statue still stands and stares us down?
Firstly, all dictators do not take human rights assumptions. Secondly, if your family or someone's family, Mr. X's family feels that that dictator was very bad, Mr. Y's family would not feel that dictator did very bad. It is Mr. Y's family's right to have the right to support that dictator, and that is essentially what my second line of argument is as well. Because inherently it is fundamentally incorrect to assume that dictators did all bad things. Because the first thing that, like I said, the first thing that all dictators look for is legitimacy from the people, and for that they need to do good things for the people as well. So what you're essentially doing is that by changing history and bringing down the monuments, what are you doing? You're disregarding all the good actions that you did, and we believe that is fundamentally incorrect. Why is that? Because the overlying principle of acknowledging all good actions is being negated over here, ladies and gentlemen. So all good actions that have been done by any individual, whether it be a democratic leader, whether it be a dictatorial leader, we believe that all of their good actions ought to be acknowledged by the government. Because if you are erasing all the good actions that they did, what are you simply doing? You simply debasing doing of good things as well. And that is simply where our case over there lies, ladies and gentlemen. Because let's take an example of Pakistan itself. Musharraf was removed by the people, but still Musharraf did do good things, and his right to be, he has his own right to be acknowledged. Ziaullah died, but it is his right to be acknowledged. All the good things that he did need to be acknowledged. Ayub Khan was removed by the people, deposed by the people, because of an uprising. But there is a right for a youth to be acknowledged for the good things that he might have done. So on that regard, or on that principle, and there are people who support these dictators too violent. So on that regard as well, we believe it is the right of these dictators to be acknowledged for the good things, and the government has no right to change to alter the course of history, because history defines the way we work in the future. Once to alter it, the repercussions of that can simply not be known. Thank you.
Alright, thank you very much. Thank you.
If you're heartbroken, Madam Chair, and you constantly see a picture of your ex-boyfriend who cheated on you, I'm pretty sure that you're going to have a hard time moving on and getting on with your life. This is the same principle, Madam Chair, that we from the side government wants you to think about. What I'm going to talk about as Deputy Prime Minister is I'm going to look at the factors that creates a conducive democracy in two contexts. The first is in a post-war reconstruction, and second, extension to post-transition democracy. But before anything else, allow me to respond to everything that we've heard from previous speaker. The first is this assertion that side government is assuming that dictators have done no good and they have no supporters. This is false. We never heard anything like this from side government, because we agree these people may have done good and they have supporters. But in this context, we have to safeguard from these things from being able to erode or delay the transitions to democracy. Because if you look at the context, why were they called dictators to begin with? They were called dictators because they curtailed the rights of these people. These people are being shot if they try to rally against the government, if they're being oppressed, their human rights are being violated, their families are taken away from them. But the more important question is, why were they deposed? They were deposed, Madam Chair, because these people have had enough, and they think that they have to collectively act as a nation to depose or get rid of this individual. These are the kinds of things that tells us that they may have done good, but it's outweighed by the evil things that they have done. And these are the things, Madam Chair, that their supporters are not supposed to be able to rally about. But then their responses are two levels. First is, it's an unfair political expression curtailment, and the second is, you do not alter history. First, Madam Chair, it's not a random curtailment of political expression. In this case, in the special context that side government has set up, Madam Chair, there has to be a hierarchy of values. There are trade-offs. Obviously, Madam Chair, if we allow these individuals to be able to pursue their political sentiments, Madam Chair, it's going to erode the probability of having a democratic transition, because these people believe that there should be a dictator. Obviously, they do not fit together. But the second is this, it alters history, right to information, and to learn from the mistakes done by these dictators. Sit down. Remember, Madam Chair, these symbols are not objective symbols. These are symbols and written documents that seeks to glorify dictatorship. Is this the kind of lesson that we want these people to learn? Is this the kind of thing that we want people to be constantly reminded of? Remember, Madam Chair, their arguments may be good in itself, but it's not engaging to the frame provided to you by side government. Remember, we are in a post-conflict reconstruction. People have to be able to move forward as a country, as a nation. They need to have catharsis. If you're always reminded, Madam Chair, by having a symbol that tells you that it's okay if your family died, we still celebrate that person who took away the lives of your parents, do you think that these people would be able to come together and move forward? I want you to go on with my constructives. The factors to conducive democracy. Ideally, Madam Chair, for democracies to exist, there just has to be a system that ensures that the majority of the people rule, but the rights of the majority are protected, and that human rights and civil liberties of citizens are also protected. However, in the context of a post-war reconstruction, these are far more elementary, because in these situations, there are power vacuum or power struggles that may exist, and second of all, there's no central authority that controls state affairs and facilitates social order. And in order for us to move forward and transition to democracy, we have to achieve a relative social cohesion. We need to, Madam Chair, transition to democracy, which involves the negotiation and acceptance of democratic rules and procedures, the building or restructuring of political institutions, and channeling of political competition along democratic lines. All these things, Madam Chair, are never supported by the ideals of a dictatorship. So we need to eradicate elements that negatively fragments these sectors. Prime Minister have already told you how these things glorify and even symbolically extending the ideologies of deposed dictators. It emboldens supporters to continue the legacy of their leaders, Madam Chair. And one of the most important prerequisites for democracy is a collective culture that recognizes the value of democracy. We cannot afford to have entities that seeks to bring this down by telling them that it's wrong for you to transition to democracy and it's better for us to have this leader. It does not foster an attitude of toleration, bargaining, and compromise, Madam Chair. And even if we try to look at it in the present context, or assuming that they have already transitioned to democracy, even progressive democracies, Madam Chair, necessarily are able to curtail certain rights and freedom of expressions because they represent clear and present danger in society. And this is where I'm going to talk about the power of symbols. Symbols are essential elements that create nationalistic cohesion. It creates a sense of identity and belongingness. And to some extent, Madam Chair, these can be very powerful symbols, so strong that it can even cause people to kill and become violent. This is the reason why when the Prophet Muhammad was portrayed in a caricature, people associated with that imagery, Madam Chair, reacted negatively. And this is the same reason why icons such as the swastika or the symbol of Ku Klux Klan are being curtailed in even liberal democracies because they know that these things are entities and elements that seeks to curtail ability of individuals from being able to exercise their rights and able to protect themselves from these things because they know that these things not only threaten the lives of those people, Madam Chair, but it also represents an emboldenment and an emboldenment for those people who believes in them. Yes.
Okay, simply so I went out of my house, I saw the statue of this dictator, and yet I thought that this was a dictator that we took down to bring in democracy. And that is the kind of history that we have.
Sir, that's assuming that the dictator that you have there, or the monument that you have there, is a dictator that's already shut down or whatever. But the point is, Madam Chair, it's still fragile and it's very fresh from the minds of these people about what happened. Remember, it's not, it's not 30 years or 50 years or even 100 years after this dictator was deposed. It's fresh in the heads of these people what this dictator has. And remember, the images and the elements that we're taking down are things that represent and even glorify these dictators, Madam Chair. Obviously, Madam Chair, these things talk about the celebration of how these people have successfully deposed this dictator. Obviously, we're not going to take that down. But we are very selective and targeted in the entities and the elements and even written documents that we're going to take down. These are things that actively seek to glorify and even justify why that dictator did what he did. And we think, Madam Chair, that in terms of how we look at this both in the existence or in the context of a post-war reconstruction and even in the post-transition democracy, we don't think that it's going to create any sense of value. These are the reasons why, Madam Chair, we think that the policy of side government is pretty much justified. Thank you.
Alright, thank you very much. Our deal of today is Shiraz.
You know what? There is a problem with the team government because they just assume that there is going to be just one girlfriend that the boyfriend had who he was rude to. Because in this particular case, there is not one girlfriend. There are many girlfriends that a boyfriend had, and there are sentiments of every single girlfriend involved. So even if the boyfriend was bad to both his girls, still one might be in love with her boyfriend. But in order for the two girls to live collectively, you cannot simply take away the right of that very girl to keep the very picture if one girl wants it. And that is the kind of debate that we want to have. Let's just understand. The whole case, and this is seriously, ladies and gentlemen, let's just listen. This is a case that's based on perceptions that people might just have a perception of just seeing the statue over there and just assuming that, look, he was a very, very good person. That's a big assumption because I already said this in my point of information, which by the way was never answered. If I go out of my house and I see the dictator's image just standing over there, and I can remind myself, because that's perception, I can remind myself that this is the dictator that we took out and brought in democracy, because of this dictator, and that is the transitional phase of democracy. So, basing their whole case about perceptions in principle is just not self-proving, because if it's about perceptions, I can simply look at the statue and simply tell myself that this was the very dictator that we took out to bring in democracy. So, with this point of information, their whole case actually does fall flat on its head. Apart from that, let's just try to analyze something really important. They don't talk about this, the legacies, and will tell you why this is something that's important. Because in principle, if they're not removing the legacies, then why is a statue something that is so important in nature? Because the statue might have positive or negative perceptions related to it. So we don't understand the idea of symbolism, because symbols can have a negative or a positive feeling associated. So that's the reason why I believe that even if it's there, people can still think negatively about that statue and say that, look, this was the person that we took down. So that is why we believe that the whole idea is in itself not self-proof. Apart from that, sir, let's just try to understand something really important. That when you talk about the idea of transitioning democracy or a reunion or unifying the people together, what kind of a start are you trying to give to democracy? That we are violently going to take out any history leader that you ever had, even if he was the worst person in the world. And that is where we believe that the whole idea in general is something that's wrong. Because when you talk about a reunion, there are people, according to them, who might like the dictator in the very first place, who are going to be a part of your country, who you have to cater to. Because in democracies, even if they are a minority of people who care for the dictator, you still have to protect their sector on a first level. So we believe that in principle on this first level, this is something that is not going to help. Apart from that, and this is something very important, sit down, listen to this. When you talk about democracies and transitioning phase of democracies, and this is going to be in a positive case as well, you need to understand something very important. When you want to signify democracies, in principle, if you do something good for the people, or if you're doing good for the people who actually like the dictator in the very first place, that is how you bring in acceptance to those as well who want to appreciate democracies. Because there are two groups, one who like the dictator, one who like the democracy. The people who like the democracies are never going to appreciate the dictator. Fine, full stop. The people who don't like the democracies are the ones that you really have to cater to right now. Because if they do not compromise with you on certain situations, then that essentially means that you're negating their existence in the very first place. And that is why we believe that essentially the whole idea is flawed. Because again, if there are people who like democracies, they are going to stick with the democracies and they are going to have a negative perception. So we believe the whole idea itself about reunion has to cater to every single person living in the particular country. So we believe the transition phase is not even important here. So my positive case is about 2 points before that.
Sir, you have to understand that your exercise of rights is relative to how other people are also able to exercise their rights. If your exercise of your political right prevents people from moving on and having their democratic practice, we don't think that that is equally important.
So if there is a statue outside, why wouldn't people have a democratic principle? They wouldn't go for elections because the statue is just sitting over there. We don't understand the whole logic. Because if people do like democracy, then the person who's ruling you after the post-conflict is doing something good for you. That is the reason why we believe that the existence of the statue won't even matter for transitioning phase of democracy in the very first place. Apart from that, and I said this again and again, the statue can also mean that you really fought for democracy and this was a dictator that you took down in the very first place. So the whole idea of perception is flawed. Let's just understand the democratic celebration and the whole idea of cultural heritage that is very necessary. First things first, how do you build up a good democracy and how would you want to cater to a good democracy? That's the first fundamental question. You need to understand the whole idea of history, how you took down the dictator, what that dictator did, because people really need to know that this dictator did exist, he had a heritage, he did these particular things, he did not do these particular things. That is how you learn from a dictatorship to develop into a democracy. Because the very existence, until and unless you realize the existence of something that already existed, you can't learn from. And that is where we believe that you have to learn from the very symbols, from the very heritage that you essentially have. So it's not about just taking down the statue, it's about the kind of symbolism that you're giving by taking down the statue that the country never even had the history. democracy was there in the very first place, it never even took down the dictator according to their logic. So the whole assumptions on the part are not being able to be applied. Lastly, cultural heritage, and this is something really important, and I talked about this in my refutations as well. How did democracy start? That is what people need to know. What happened? Why democracy started in the very first place? Why does democracy exist in the very first place? What kind of freedom do people have in the very first place? And even if, let's just talk about an even if argument argument. Let's just talk about Saddam Hussein, because there are a lot of people in Iraq who think that United States of America took down Saddam Hussein. So we don't understand the whole idea of genocide and the whole idea of killing of people does not even apply here, because the underlying assumption behind their whole case is that the person, it's all going to be black and white. It's never about political struggle, because people might also hate democratic leaders. Do you erase history of democratic leaders? No. So lastly, we need to understand, whenever you're going to start a democracy, you need to understand something. Even if there was a bad dictator, or even if there was a very, very bad democratic leader, still the people need to acknowledge the fact that this person existed to move on. Because if you move away from reality, you cannot actually appreciate the present that exists. So we talked to you about the idea of symbols and how it's based on perception, and the whole idea can also revolve around here. We talked to you about how on a principle level it's incorrect to remove the acknowledgement of history. So we believe that if you want these people to succeed for democracy, let them appreciate the fact that how democracy started in the very first place. Thank you.
Okay, the House thanks our Zelo calls our government for today's jam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, when symbols were created, they were created because, as a leader, I wanted to be remembered for my actions. They were created for the very purpose that leaders wanted to live forever. They wanted to create this invincibility within themselves that constantly reminds its population that I am here, I am to look down on you, I am ominous, and I will look down on you for the rest of your lives. We think that it is fundamentally important for society to take away this cloak of invincibility, to move beyond the oppression and recognize that now is the dawn of a new age. And these are going to be my two questions for this debate. The first is the policy of side affirmative legitimate? And second, how will we achieve post-war reconstruction effectively? So firstly, is this policy legitimate? The first thing that we heard from negative side was a dissension saying that this act is too violent. First of all, this act isn't too violent, ladies and gentlemen, because of the fact that they've ignored the very premise, that says that we're talking about a deposed dictator. We accept that dictators in general may have contributed something good in these societies, but obviously this contribution is very little compared to the bad actions that they've done. I mean, it's very simple for us to assume that dictators were not just deposed for the reason that society wanted them to get deposed. Obviously, if you are a dictator and you are able to sustain a large majority of support in your population, means that you have done a degree of good to retain that power. But if you were taken away and you were shut down by the majority of the population, it only meant that your actions, your bad actions, have already outweighed your good actions. And they may have had good actions, but we say on two levels. First, the good actions may only be limited to the supporters that they had. It's the very reason why, for example, in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe is only giving budget to the people that he wants, to the cronies and to the communities that support him, but ignoring the rest of the population who wants him out in the first place. But secondly, we're also talking about society who has already taken down the leadership. So in principle, the victory is now towards the winners of that type of government, which are the people who have taken them out of power. The second thing that they told us was that this act isn't commensurate. We say that this act is commensurate for the very reasons that, number one, the principle of permanence of memory of these symbols constitutes the necessity for us to take down these types of symbols, Madam Speaker. As a society, we have a right to censor symbols and even documents that remember the hate that is surrounded by the leadership. And we've argued this from side affirmative very effectively. That's the reason why, for example, in Germany, hate speech constitutes the fact that you cannot display the swastika symbol because it remembers or it tries to pertain a bad memory to the Jews, who are obviously not something that we are agreed upon. That's why not all political views have to be acknowledged. That's what this side of the House wants us to acknowledge. We say that some political views are just too sadistic for us to tolerate to exist in these societies. That's why on the first level, this has to be a legitimate action. Well, what about the right to information? They talked about this a lot in their substantive. We say, first of all, the right to information is something that should be objective. Like, we aren't really saying that we can't utter the name of Saddam Hussein. That's not the point of taking down the documents and taking down the symbols in the statues. We will acknowledge that history books should look and tell the story of that transitioning government, but it should look at it in light of the facts, not in light of the perspective of the publishers who wanted to glorify the actions of the dictatorship. That's the very difference between our policy and all of the things that side negative wanted to stand in this debate. The final thing that they told us was that, no, we're simply pandering on perception. First of all, the perception that we're pandering on, ladies and gentlemen, is the perception of an overwhelming majority. We're not just talking about one person hating a dictatorship. We're talking about a population who has hated the dictatorship enough that they have put into their hands to take that dictatorship away. So we're not really considering the fact that this is something that's just out in the air. This is an overwhelming majority. Democracies work in that way, and we have to respect that action. Yes.
If your democracy is deciding which political motive to support and which not, then how is your democracy any different from that of a dictatorship?
Because we look at the opinion of the population. And we respect the fact that they don't want to be remembered of the harsh oppressive actions that their former leader has done upon them. So, to the second question, how do we achieve post-war reconstruction? The first thing that I want to engage with the other side is this entire population effect. And they talked about this like in length. The first thing is, let's look at two characters in this debate. Firstly, is the supporters of the dictators, and second is the triumphant population that we talked about in length. How do we suppose to achieve reconstruction by tying them in together? Now, their side says that supporters of the dictator have the right to information. We've taken that on, saying that we're not going to ban them from remembering the name. But on the second level, we've also been very clear in terms of the analysis as to what the symbol contributes to the resonance of the supporters of the dictator. These supporters, as what we've said in substantive, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that these supporters are characterized in a way that they believe in the dictatorship because the dictatorship has a cloak of invincibility. And the symbols retain that power. So as long as these symbols exist, there is obviously a legitimacy for the supporters of the dictator to rally back and even abuse the population once more. The effect of taking down these symbols, Madam Speaker, is that it eases in the transition. It destroys the invincibility cloak and the ability of that population, of that oppressive population, to rally back and take away the right of that democracy. But also in terms of the triumphant population, it creates a system of catharsis. Individuals are now relieved by the fact that not only do they have the moral victory, but they also have the practical victory in the end. So then, how do we hasten the reconstruction of society? We've talked about this even more by talking about how this legitimizes and affirms the power of the current government, and how, in general, symbols may be used to back and rally point ideologies. There's a harm of relapse in these societies. That's why we have to take them down. That's why we have to erase any record that tries to confirm and even legitimize the human rights violations done by these leaderships. So we accept that transitions may not be instant. That's not the point of side affirmative. So if they're saying, well, you're not going to achieve the benefit in a short run, we concede to that. It's probably not going to surface in an instant. But the point is, this is the step in the most progressive direction. We have to allow for these governments to obtain power that will not be disrupted, power that will respect choices, and power that will eventually lead to peace. For those reasons, we are extremely proud to propose.
Okay, House decks are done. For today's time.
So ladies and gentlemen, let's again read the topic. It involved a word called legacies. Legacies and monuments. Now I'll tell you why all three of us have really emphasized on this word called legacy. Now the point is, and even if for argument's sake they want to go to a La La Land and want to erase all the history of people and nothing bad happened to them, they were a happy people and assume this way democracy will be very beneficial for them and suddenly they will become a superpower. But even if we were suppose that we are in La La Land and we are not in Macau, then ladies and gentlemen, the fact of the matter is that when you're not erasing any legacies, not erasing the raisings from history books, then basically what are you changing then? Because if you're in status quo and the legacies are there, then basically the very memory they want to erase will never be erased. That is if they don't want to erase the legacy. Because, and if they do want to erase the legacy, then that, ladies and gentlemen, is principally wrong. Because when we asked them about legacy, they really had nothing to say. So we are still confused about it. So if they want to erase legacy, even then you're doing something principally wrong, and that is revising history. That is making history rejected to a government bias book. Let's start calling that book by the name of that Democratic Party then, ladies and gentlemen. Now coming on to the issue of today's house. Now firstly I have five issues of contention. Firstly about the monuments, secondly about transitional democracy, and thirdly about unfair political expression, fourthly about different perspectives, and lastly the very nitty-gritties of this debate. Now coming on to the first argument that really became a very major line stance for the proposition about monuments. Here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, when they talk about general consensus, and if there's a general consensus of the people, they will finish the very monuments. Now, if they are talking about general consensus, ladies and gentlemen, then the funny thing here is that, then what Hitler did was really not that wrong, because in Hitler time, the general consensus was that Jews are bad. In Gujarat, ladies and gentlemen, what happened to Muslims? Then the general consensus there was that Muslims were minority, and general consensus that Muslims should be dead, and then the BJP had that very support. Then that, according to their very definition, sir, you can listen to this one, then that was also a general consensus, and then let's legalize that too, and then that is also right according to that definition, and that is what we have a problem with the general consensus, that does not show the very element of a paternalistic government which has not catered to the rights of minorities too, ladies and gentlemen. Sit down, sir. Now, and then which I will come on later. Now coming on to their very constant reminder of expression point, and the monuments point. Now here's the thing, gentlemen, as my first speaker and second speaker told me, that who are they to tell the gentlemen that, well, by looking at that very monument or when his ex-girlfriend, gentlemen, they'll suddenly feel a very vigilantic feeling for it or they'll get sad. But the problem here, gentlemen, even if one person likes that very monument, or if the other person likes that very girlfriend picture for the very analogy they gave, then ladies and gentlemen, in order for them to unite, which was their point of transitional democracy, and then that would happen, because if you raise that very monument, that very unification factor will go out of date. But if you keep that monument, then here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, I've discussed this at two levels. First level, ladies and gentlemen, their very assumption is that dictator did all that. But we see that in order for dictator to pay, he has to do some good to remain in power. So even if one person likes him, then that monument can't say. But even if someone has a problem with dictator, then do say anything they want, but don't erase the monument, because if you erase that very monument, ladies and gentlemen, then that is showing, ladies and gentlemen, that you are not taking the rights of the minorities. We say, ladies and gentlemen, can be different perspectives. Someone can actually be brave by looking at this minority and say how successful we were by saying that there is a minority and we defeated that very dictator. That's a different in perception here, and that is our line against theirs. So you can't really refute that, can you? Now sit down. Now coming on to the transition democracy. Now here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about transition democracy, the whole point was, well, reunion, the whole point was, well, how will you unite this very society? But here's our problem, because when, I'll take you know, the problem here is, ladies and gentlemen, when you have a society, and how can you imagine to unite a society when one sector of your society might be minority, might be the lowest minority, but even if there are even one of the few hundreds of people who like that very dictator, then the problem is, ladies and gentlemen, then you are not unite, because if you finish that very monument, ladies and gentlemen, then you are arranging uprising and aggression, ladies and gentlemen, between that very society, because some people do like it. But by keeping that very monument in place, you're not doing anything, because you're not even saying that he was bad, or you're not even saying he was good, ladies and gentlemen. gentlemen, because the debate is not about whether democracy is bad or democracy is better or democracy are some good people or dictatorship or evil, because you can never prove that. Gentlemen, give me an example how you can never prove that, because not even once they gave an example, let us say transitional democracy, how is it good? Because we give you example, we talk about Saddam Hussein, and if you so want to talk about examples, then we see how good the transitional democracy is. The currency has fallen by 40%. If you look at Pakistan, when Musharraf came on, and what the basic situation is, our GDP has gone down by 20%. So basically, you cannot say dictatorship is better than democracy, or democracy better than dictatorship, but the point is you can never prove that. And once you can never prove that, gentlemen, then by pretending that agreement, by finishing that very monument, that is fundamentally wrong. Don't you agree, sir?
Sir, political exercise is about compromise. This is the reason why we even disallow white supremacist political parties from being able to campaign and rally for their political sentiments.
Talking about, well, ladies and gentlemen, political supremacy or what, here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, we again and again are talking about a government which is supposed to be paternalistic. If that democracy, that big government, that will answer the question about unfair political expression. Here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about unfair political expression, these government which according to the and there was their point third speaker speech that the government consider which political party to choose, ladies and gentlemen. That is not legal, because if you're doing that, if you're allowing government party to choose which political party they can allow, then that is dictatorship, ladies and gentlemen. Then they are considering to they are supporting dictatorship, ladies and then they are contradicting their whole case if they lost it. And that was I'm quoting ladies and third speaker. And if ladies and gentlemen, as a paternity candidate, they have to take right off their minority, as I already told you. Now, coming on to perspective, as I already told you, everyone has different perspectives. Some might like the person, some might not take. Some might even feel a sign of victory, that we defeated that right dictator and we got dictatorship, and we said there's nothing wrong with that. And lastly, the very difficult of it. Firstly, talking about the assumption, Zimbabwe, firstly, is not a dictatorship, it was a bad democracy, sir. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, coming on to who decides is very good and bad, because they wanted this debate to turn into a democracy versus dictatorship, but at the end of the day, who decides whether this democracy is good or this democracy is bad, or this dictatorship is good or dictatorship is bad? The main point at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, is that they are not changing anything, because they did not talk about legacy. We told you how if you are not talking about legacy, then if you are not against legacy, then basically not changing anything, because at the end of the day, history books will contain that everything. And on second level, if you are, because they have cleared it, if you are raising everything from the legacy, then ladies and gentlemen, you are doing something fundamentally wrong to the whole human right, and that is, ladies and gentlemen, that you are rephrasing history and changing mind into La La Land. And we don't want to go to La La Land. We want to go to the real world. And we want to debate a competition where we talk about realistics. I mean, realistics are where we need to care about minorities as well, and that's what potentialist government do. If it doesn't do it, that is taking away people's right, and that is dictatorship, ladies and gentlemen, and that is wrong. Thank you.
Alright, time for reply. The first time today is from Mr. Ali.
Here. There was a fundamental reason why the opposition has kept on asking them about legacy. The fundamental reason, because the topic not only talks about erasing or tearing down the monuments, it also talks about erasing the legacy, right? So even if you torn down the monument, the legacy might still remain in history books. So you're still really not achieving what you want to achieve. So that is the first level on which you're failing, ladies and gentlemen. That is exactly what we're talking about. On the second level as well, the entire case was about transitional democracies and post-war conflict situations, right? So transitional democracy. How does transitional democracy develop itself? And that is the analysis that was given throughout the opposition, right? We've given you the analysis that if you want a transitional democracy to develop, that transitional democracy will develop if it caters to its people in the best manner possible. If it gives them all those things that a dictator was possibly not giving them, right? Like, for example, if the dictator was not able to give them food, shelter, and clothing, transitional democracy can give them that. If the dictator was not giving them freedom of political choice, transitional democracy can do that, ladies and gentlemen. That is essentially what they're against, because firstly, on the first level, they're not giving them freedom of political choice, because if people still do want to support that very dictator, they have a right to do that, because that is their freedom of political choice. And we asked them this point of information as well, that how is your democracy different from a dictatorship if that very democracy is talking about the freedom of political choice from these very people? No answer came from this side. And also on the second level, we believe that once you have a transitional democracy that is tearing down all of these monuments, and trying to change alter the course of history, which it's been trying to do, but still if it's trying to do that, you're presenting a very bad image of that very democracy, ladies and gentlemen, of being very violent, and that is exactly the kind of image that a transitional democracy cannot do. And we also argue this on a third level. We talk about people within these very countries that might support these very dictators, ladies and gentlemen. So if you want to unify these people in a transitional democracy, in a post-war conflict situation, you cannot do that by taking away the monuments or erasing the history of people that these people actually support, right? So we argued this, and we did this by removing the assumption that these dictators have done all bad things. We very clearly showed you that these dictators, you cannot simply assume that these dictators did all bad things, and we can assume on a very realistic level that these dictators would have done good things as well. And it's principally incorrect to recognize them for the good things that they have done over the course of history. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you are not recognizing their good things that they did do, you're basically debasing the doing of good by these very leaders, ladies and gentlemen, and that is the wrong precedent that you will be setting, ladies and gentlemen. That is the exact problem that we see within the entire system, ladies and gentlemen. So on a transitional democracy level, we feel that their argument about transitional democracies moving forward by simply removing statues would not really suffice, ladies and gentlemen. Transitional democracy would only move forward once that transitional democracy looks after its people in the best way possible and caters to their real problem. What they said was no, that it will act as a situation of catharsis for the people, right? They said that it's about perception that it creates. We firstly argued that perceptions are subjective. We said that given that perceptions are subjective, people might not automatically feel bad when they look at the statue, right? So that is one thing that we argued about, and that is something that you cannot assume. People might be afraid of while looking at the statue, people might not be afraid. So when you have something abstract of that sort, you cannot really remove that very statue, because the underlying fundamental principle still holds. Because you have the right to learn from history. The government, we believe, has simply no right to alter the course of history, to alter the change of evolution within the society as it is occurred, or to alter the kind of struggles that result in the society. We believe that people have the right to know the history, the way it occurred, and learn from it in the way it occurred, ladies and gentlemen. And we believe that serves the purpose of history in the best manner possible, by as a learning tool from which people can learn in the best manner possible. But they said that no, these dictators were deposed, right? Because the good party triumphed. We simply asked them, first, who decides good and bad? We said that we asked this question to them, that who decides what is good and who decides what is bad. We said that let the people decide. When we talked about within our case our argument about freedom of political choice, we said that give the people the freedom of political choice, let these people decide by themselves. Because even if the people who support these people, these dictators are in a minority, you need to cater them because they're equal citizens of the state, ladies and gentlemen. That is where the entire argument about freedom of political choice comes in, ladies and gentlemen. So that is what the problem was. They based their case on perception, which can never really be quantified and can never really be judged for sure. That is what the problem was. We believe the right to information of the people rests with the people, and historical revisionism within itself is simply incorrect, and that is not in the working of transitional democracy to do something of the sort.
Okay, thank you very much. Last reply, Lee.
Couple of things I want to say about them in this debate. First of all, Madam Chair, this debate is not about history, it's about memories. It's about not what people should know, but it's about what people remember. Remember when a leader comes into the world and then leads his people and he betrays them. They lose their obligation, they lose their chance to allow these people to remember them for the right reasons, Madam Chair. And what sticks in this debate are how people react to the memories of the human rights violations, whether you oppose to these things or you supported this dictator, Madam Chair. Secondly, it's not about what we think is what they think, who decides what's good or bad. It's about what a transitioning democracy should think is best for its people, ladies and gentlemen. Something that they never nuance in this debate. You know, for an opposition that recognizes that these dictators did bad things despite the fact that they did good things, they certainly give so much care and support to the people who supported human rights violations, ladies and gentlemen. Last I checked, in a democracy, the majority rules, and a paternal state, contrary to what opposition gives idea of a free-for-all anarchic state, protects the general welfare, Madam Chair, of the survivors of that oppressive regime. First of all, let's try to close down that pseudo-definitional challenge coming from leader of opposition. Because according to him, the debate isn't just about monuments, they're about legacies. What exactly are legacies to them, Madam Chair? Oh wait, monuments can be legacies as well. They didn't explain why monuments don't have the legacies and what is the exclusive value of their non-existent legacy that our policy does not have. By virtue of the power vested in me as Prime Minister in this debate, I demand opposition to be dynamic, ladies and gentlemen. But then again, they define legacies as history. Since when have objective